everybody, to the Illusion of Consensus podcast. I'm Professor Jay Bhattacharya, and today I'm delighted to have here with me Kim Witzak, who is a patient advocate for going back decades and has been quite active during the COVID pandemic as a critic of the FDA and also an advocate for patients at the FDA. Kim, thank you for joining me. Really delighted to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation. I've been following your work for the last couple of years, and I'm glad to be a partner with you in it.
Well, I think the reason I was so excited to be able to talk with you is that first, I think listeners should really hear your story about how you got involved in the FDA regulation of safety of drugs, because it's a really to me, when I first heard it, it was a heartbreaking story. But also, in a way, the way that you've done something constructive with this, with this, and I think it points to the fact that it shouldn't just be doctors and statisticians who are involved in the regulation of drugs. Patients themselves, family members of patients themselves, need to be fundamentally involved in decisions that the FDA makes about the drug safety. And as we saw during the COVID pandemic, when you have really it's pharmaceutical companies that are much more closely involved than patients, real bad things can happen. So why don't we start by, can you in 2003, you had something happen to you that changed your life. Can you tell that story?
Well, it's what I like to call myself, an accidental advocate, because trust me, I never chose to be doing this work that I'm doing, the drug safety work. But on August 6, 2003, so over 20 years ago, I received a call from my dad that told me that my husband of almost 10 years was found dead, hanging from the rafters of our garage. My husband, Woody, was not depressed. He had no history of depression. He had just started his dream job with a startup company a few months prior and went to see his general practitioner, his GP that he's gone to for years. And Woody was a guy who needed 8 hours of sleep. So he went to his GP and he always had this impression, his doctors always stitch him. He's a big athlete. So, they stitched him up. They fixed broken bones. So he went in there and said, I wasn't sleeping. And so the doctor, after a short visit, gave him a 3-week sample pack of the antidepressant Zoloft and told him it would take the edge off and help him sleep. Ironically, I was out of the country.
This is 2003.
2003. And
sorry. Yeah. So, that's when that's like the height of the use of these SSRIs, these selective serotonin receptor inhibitors to treat depression. Lots and lots of patients are being diagnosed with depression who probably a generation before wouldn't have been diagnosed because there wasn't such an easy drug.
No, available. And I look back when I happened to be, it was my busy time of the season and I'm in advertising, and I happened to be out of the country the first 3 weeks when he was on the drug. So it was kind of like the perfect storm. I wasn't there when he got put on the drug. The drug that he was given, the samples, automatically doubled the dose after week 1. So here's Woody thinking he's a good soldier. He does what the doctor tells him. And I'll never forget when I came home from New Zealand, I found Woody he came through our back door, completely drenched through his dress shirt, crying, and he fell to the floor in a fetal position. And he was like, Kim, you got to help me. I don't know what's happening to me. My head's outside my body. And he's bawling. And I was like, I've never seen that kind of behavior ever from him. And so we eventually calmed him down. And he called his doctor, and the doctor said, you got to give the drug 4 to 6 weeks to kick in. And so every night the next week, Woody would be like, what do you think about beating this feeling from his head? Everything was just outside his body looking in. And, interesting, when I got that call from my dad, in 1 second, my entire life, flashed before me, the life that I had thought I was living. We were just planning to have kids and booked our 10-year anniversary trip. But, at that time, I never once questioned the drug. And even at the time when Woody that was having that experience, I didn't question the drug because they were given to him by his doctor. They were FDA approved, and they were advertised as safe and effective. And the night that Woody was found, like I said, it was my busy time, so I happened to be out of town again. And the coroner asked me a question, asked if Woody was taking on any medication. And the only medication Woody was taking was Zoloft. And she proceeded to say, I'm going to need to take it with us. It might have something to do with his death. So that was like clue number one. And then the other thing that happened that same day that Woody was found, the front page of our newspaper had an article that said the UK finds link between antidepressants and suicide in teens. And so Woody didn't leave a note, but those were in my mind, those were our clues, because everything intuitively in the deepest part of me was like, there is no way Woody killed himself. Like, there is no way Woody went from not being able to sleep, head outside the body, and hanging in 5 weeks. And so my brother-in-law and I started, actually my brother-in-law, the night that Woody was found, Googled Zoloft and suicide and found out that the FDA had hearings in 1991 on the emergence of violence and suicide in Prozac. And at that time, every one of those advisory board members took money from pharmaceutical companies making antidepressants. And the FDA said, and they voted no, of course, they didn't see any link. The FDA then told Eli Lilly, the makers of Prozac, to study suicidality. They never did, and the FDA never followed up on it. Fast forward, now we have Zoloft and Paxil approved, as well as for kids. And so when Woody died in 2003, that became our mission, and we called it the Battle for Woody, because we were like, there is no way that's just going to be the legacy. We're going to go. We didn't have warnings, so we started going out to DC, and we met with FDA, HHS. I mean, anybody that would listen.
So you say you didn't have warnings, right? So that's actually a big scandal, because the doctor that prescribed the drug to Woody should have told him that there was some question about this, and should have been very, very careful about, okay, if you're starting to have any problems, come see me, or I mean, was there any of that that happened?
And if you think about it,
no.
That's probably one of the biggest things, and what our mission was, is to go get warnings. There were no warnings. There were no even association. Woody, we didn't even know it was an antidepressant, right? So Woody actually, if you think about it, Woody got the drug off label for insomnia. It wasn't even for depression. So that's a problem right there. He didn't even know. Yeah. And we should have actually, I look back and go, we didn't even know that there were hearings in 1991, that Prozac was even anything in the same class as Zoloft. And I wonder if Woody was told, like, hey, just so you know, this is an antidepressant. I truly believe Woody would have said, well, I'm not depressed. Why are you giving? I just can't sleep, right? And I also look at it, there are so many things, like, should have that been the first thing that they gave to Woody, is just that quick fix, of a pill? That wasn't what Woody just needed to sleep.
I mean, was that so? Did he go to a general practice doctor, or was it like a psychiatrist?
No, he just went to his family doctor, who he always went to, that did his yearly physicals.
I mean, I think one of the things that sort of little understood, but is really, really important. Like, when you have a drug that's approved, that's touted as safe, it'll get used by everybody for lots and lots of things, even by doctors that aren't used to treating patients with depression. And you're absolutely right. Like, having Zoloft be the first line of defense when you have the first thing someone thinks about when they have a patient with insomnia, that doesn't make sense. Right? You should be doing like before you jump to that, there should have been other things that should have happened. But because Zoloft was available, and around that time, the big thing was, well, there's underdiagnosed depression going on, and you have now a tool to deal with it. These SSRIs.
And I think that's exactly right. Is that for a lot of people that these drugs, especially they're available, they were, and the way they were being marketed to doctors from the drug companies is like, oh, if you're not sleeping, it might be a sign of depression. And so I think, but yet ultimately I did have a lawsuit. I had a failure to warn wrongful death lawsuit against Pfizer, where we got a lot of documents out from under seal and knowing and kind of seeing the machine, because at this time that Woody died, I had no idea that there were all these other lawsuits that were happening that was in, like I don't remember if you remember that comedian, Phil Hartman, who was a Saturday Night Live, and his wife took Zoloft and killed him and then killed herself. Well, they had a big lawsuit against Pfizer. It was secretly settled. And so I had no idea. But during that time, and that was probably one of the most fascinating things, is getting out documents and seeing that whole process. But they intentionally, so the side effect that Pfizer kept from the doctors was this thing called akathisia. And that is that head outside the body. It's a constant moving. And Pfizer actually, their chief medical officer wrote about this condition, said that if patients get akathisia, it's not so much that it's drug or that it's the depression or the disease. It could be drug induced. And so they said, quote unquote, death can be a welcome result. Well, that journal article was public, right? Because that was in the journals. But what wasn't was an email that he sent to all of their sales staff that said the attached journal article is not suitable for general practitioners, but may be of interest to neurologically inclined psychiatrists. So they intentionally kept that side effect from GPs. So when Woody called to tell his doctor, because he did the right thing, right? He called to tell his doctor, head outside the body. But what did he tell him? The doctor told Woody exactly what the drug companies told them, which is you need 4 to 6 weeks for these drugs to kick in. And so that's what Woody was told. And so, I look at that, and one of the other documents, and that's why I'm a big fan of litigation, and I think we need to have litigation. One of the other documents that was pretty big was the FDA equivalent down in South Africa wrote to the chief medical officer talking about having patients on 50 milligrams, which is what Woody was on, saying they stood outside their bodies looking in. And the guy wrote back to them, oh, that happens to all SSRIs. We don't know why. And that is exactly what Woody said. And meanwhile, Pfizer knew. Woody's doctor didn't know. We certainly didn't know. But what was also fascinating during this time is the documents that also showed that the FDA was aware of some of these things and did nothing. So yeah. I think that's really where you start. Ultimately, we use these documents in our advocacy, and we were very involved at the FDA. They had public hearings where we were able to go and tell our stories, and it was hundreds of people telling their stories. And ultimately, the FDA did add black box suicide warnings in 2004 for kids and in 2006 for young adults to 24. To this day, there is no warning for all ages, although some of the documents that Pfizer has had in their files, they know that all ages are at risk. So it was a fascinating, I at that point thought, oh good, my job's done. I did my part. We got the black box warning on, and I can go back to my advertising life. But what I quickly realized, it wasn't just an issue with antidepressants. It was a systemic problem with our drug safety system. And it's, one that's driven by commercial interests, the FDA, how drugs come on market, and it's really a big business and the influence of pharmaceutical companies in the approval process.
So you responded to this really constructively. I mean, you founded a foundation. It's called Woody Matters to advocate for patient safety and psychopharmaceuticals and other drug decisions. Right? Please correct me if I
absolutely right.
I'm sure there's more scope to this. And then the FDA invited you to be on their psychopharmaceutical drug advisory committee.
That is correct.
And you've been served on that.
Yeah, that's been a very interesting role.
So So I would love, so I'd love to learn more about that. I've worked with the FDA in the past. I worked essentially as a statistician, advising them on statistical methods for identifying in post-market surveillance after a drug's been approved, identifying side effects for biologics and vaccines. And it's kind of a nerdy thing, actually. It's a statistical question. You have a group that patients that have taken a drug. You have a set of data about side effects that happen, and the statistical question is the other things that happen to the patient that take the drug or the biologic, would they have happened anyways without the drug? And so you have to find a matched group that hasn't taken it. Again a statistical thing. It's a slow and laborious process, and I have to say it's among the most frustrating scientific work I've ever done, because they are very, very slow to call a signal. Signal meaning, look, there's an uptick in a side effect after the drug that's can be attributed to the drug. In part because if they do call a signal, they have to have a black box warning that's going to have effects on the marketing of the drug. There's going to be a whole group of people that are quite unhappy that we found a signal. But my general reaction in working with them was that these were the people that work in this area in the FDA are careful scientists, very conservative, but careful. But for the most part, the only people that really had any say were other scientists. That always struck me as really narrow-minded. It struck me as, it's one thing to have a statistician say this is a signal, but you get early signals or early early ideas that, look, maybe this drug is having some effects that you wouldn't want it to have from patients. So why wouldn't you want patients to be able to tell you? So what was it like to be on this FDA Psychopharmaceutical Drug Advisory Committee? Were you the only patient advocate, or were there others?
I should back one step further, or back first. I actually met with the head of FDA right after Woody and told them the story along with other families. And they literally said, well, you're just an anecdote. They called us an anecdote. The head of that division said, well, these are anecdotes because we didn't see it in the clinical trials. And I'm like, wait a minute, that means you look at us as data points. And in my, I'm not a scientist, you are, but in my, when you have a bunch of anecdotes, aren't those data points at some point when they're real people's lives that are happening, right? And so I remember, that was kind of a aha for me, is how they view anybody who comes forward with safety signals. And so that was an experience before. And then realizing that, it's the whole post-market, and the people who approve the drugs are the same people that are responsible for looking at safety. So that seemed like a conflict of interest. But when I got on the FDA advisory committee, I'm actually, my official title is consumer representative. So I represent the general public. And then there can also be a patient rep who might have the disease. But for me, I'm supposed to represent what does it look like in the real world, right? And the voice of the real world. And what I have seen is, the FDA approval, or a lot of the sitting on that, the committee, it's about getting the drug on the market, and not so much about the safety per se. And so for me, I'm always like, well, what's going to happen when it starts being advertised and we do get reports of people? Because the real world is actually where, the drug gets used, right? And especially if it comes onto the market fast and it gets advertised, and all of a sudden that small, in a clinical trial, you might not have seen a signal emerge. But once it's in the real world and it's being advertised and millions of people are taking it, and as you mentioned earlier, a doctor can use it any way they want. You probably have less than ideal clinical study, environments. And so those signals should serve as exactly that, which is it's a signal. It should be investigated. And it should also be communicated to the public that the FDA is investigating something. I mean, alluded earlier that, when you find something, you might not be the most popular with the companies that don't want to put a warning on it or even admit that there might be a potential issue, because it does come down to sales and it could hurt the sales. But ultimately for the public and the person, the real world, the real world is not the clinical trials. The real world is the people who are going to the doctors in the middle of America, like Woody did, and assume that the drug that's safe and effective is exactly what, is safe and effective. And so when you start seeing those signals, it should serve as, we need to investigate. And so I have always, even when I go back to those initial FDA advisory committees where I was just a member of the public speaking, I remember saying, we don't need you, FDA, to determine what side effects we need to know about and which ones we don't need to know. We need to know that you're investigating something, and then we have the information. It's really about information at the end of the day for the people who are going to be taking the medications, whether it's a parent giving it to their kid or, your loved one, or even you yourself. And if there is something that they're investigating, we should know that there is something they're looking at.
I mean, first, I have to say, my reaction is that what the FDA commissioner told you, that's just shockingly patronizing, right? You're someone who's had a real injury done to you and your husband as a result of this drug. There should have been warning about that. Had the warning been there, that might have been able to prevent it. I mean, that is just, it's not right.
And it's funny.
To have done that.
Thank you. I was going to say, we created, during that time, I created an entire button campaign that everybody that showed up wore these buttons that said, "We are not anecdotes, we matter." Because these were all families that had loved ones and little kids even that killed themselves. And they were calling them anecdotes because, we're like, well, we didn't see it in the trial. Yeah, but this is the real world. This is the real trial.
That's so. And I think I think what you said about the relationship between knowledge gained in the trial and knowledge gained in the real world is exactly the central issue, right? The trials themselves have relatively small number of patients. They're cherry picked to find a situation where the drug's going to work. I mean, they're designed by drug companies to make the drug look like they work. After they're approved, they're often used in situations that were not considered in the trial. I mean, I guarantee you there was no trial on giving Zoloft for insomnia before it was approved.
Absolutely.
Guaranteed. Right? So there's no chance of the trial picking up this kind of condition in patients like Woody because he wasn't represented really in the trial. And so you have a situation where the trial provides you some signal, important signal, like it's a signal that it can work in this setting. And then it's put out in the real world. It's used in very, very different settings. And you're going to, and often if it's a successful drug, with a vastly larger number of people. And so you're going to see conditions and side effects that you didn't see in the trial just almost by design, relatively rare ones. That if the trial is, even tens of thousands of people in a trial, if you give it to millions of people, you're going to find things out that you didn't know from the trial. And so the way that the FDA commissioner dismissed this as an anecdote, it's just patronizing and wrong. Those anecdotes are real people, and those real people have suffered real injuries. And the way that the FDA should be dealing with it is by using those stories as a way to do, as you said, rapid investigation, and then honesty with people. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to pull the drug. I mean, it would depend. Maybe you can mitigate it by not. You're putting a black box saying you shouldn't be giving this drug to this group who has a high rate of this or whatnot. But that should be done rapidly, openly, and transparently, with no regard whatsoever to what effect it will have on the marketing of the drug. I mean, because the pharmaceutical companies, they already have their say. The FDA is supposed to represent the people.
Well, and that's, unfortunately, I have come to realize that I wonder if the FDA cares more about protecting their relationship with the industry than they do the people, because you're absolutely right. You would think that if there's a safety side effect, you would want that to be known, or you'd want to go investigate it. And I remember like so many people in the harmed community, and I've learned that there's a distinction between patient groups, and we can get into that later, but the harmed community, we talk about it like NTSB, like the people who approved, like if a plane goes down, you're going to send in your investigation. You're going to do a full-on investigation, aren't you, to figure out where and how did this happen? But that doesn't happen in the harms of pharmaceuticals. In fact, it seems like there's almost an attempt to downplay it. Or in the case of the antidepressants, I now sit on that committee, right? That in 1991 didn't do their job. But why did it take 13 years before warnings were put on? And if you go, and I tell every person to go watch those 1991 FDA advisory committee hearings on Prozac, and you'll hear family after family after family tell their story. You compare it to the 2004 and the 2006, the stories are identical. The clothing looks different, the fashion's different, but it's identical. So I don't understand why they didn't, at least let people know, including our doctors back then. But it was in the hype of the marketing, the campaigns, etc. So, but it is true that I wonder, who does the FDA really work for?
Hi, everyone. A quick word from our first and exciting sponsor, Alchemy Elements. Alchemy Elements is a powerful adaptogenic supplement. For those of you who don't know, adaptogens are a class of plant compounds, primarily herbs and mushrooms, which can help build the mind and body's resistance to stress. Alchemy Elements contains a very unique and carefully selected blend of 9 adaptogens, such as lion's mane, cordyceps, polygalaroot, and shilajit, and they can help boost energy, boost your immunity, and increase focus, and overall stabilize your mood. It can have a wide array of effects, which can often depend from individual to individual, but it's a great way to start your morning and generally increase your focus and your energy levels. You can just pour 1 scoop of Alchemy Elements into your morning coffee or your protein shake or smoothie, and you're off to the races. It's a great way to start the day. I use it every day. I find that it can generally stabilize my mood levels and increase focus, especially if I want to get a big project done or finish a very important task. Alchemy Elements often is a great way to kind of start and get my focus going and get me primed for whatever task I want to accomplish. We're very excited and very happy to work with Alchemy Elements. We've been working with them for a couple of months, and now in this new iteration of the podcast, we're going to continue our relationship, which is very special to us because Alchemy aligns with our mission and values of individuals taking greater ownership of their personal mental and physical health and relying less and less on corrupt and flawed, generalized kind of medical advice, and less reliance on pharmaceutical drugs, and more of a general interest and focus on holistic health. For a limited time, Illusion of Consensus readers and listeners can get 10% off their first order using the code word Illusion, or 30% off a subscription monthly order, where you can get a monthly shipment of Alchemy Elements delivered to you. For the subscription orders, you can also get with it a bonus gold kit to store your Alchemy Elements. Overall, I think Alchemy is a fantastic product. I highly recommend you check them out in the link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening, Spotify, Apple, Substack, Rumble, or YouTube. Just go to the link, use the code word Illusion, and you can get your discount and you won't regret it. All right, back to the show.
So there's a couple of just to play devil's advocate, because I think it does. I think it's important to understand what the problem here is, and it's a difficult one. All right. So just to go back to the HIV era, there were patient groups that were finding drugs that were potentially quite effective in treating some of the sort of like the AIDS symptoms, these pneumonia symptoms and so on. And the FDA was very slow to approve them. And they'd say, well, look, there's no randomized trial. They haven't done rigorous work. And there was a tremendous pressure by patient groups then for the FDA to move more quickly. And so there's a trade-off here, right? So do they protect patients by not approving a drug until they have like huge amount of data? Or in the meantime, they're harming patients. If the drug turns out to be quite good and necessary, then they've harmed a lot of patients who didn't have access to it in the meantime. So fundamentally, they're caught where there's a balancing act. There's some drugs and some that really should be approved earlier that take longer to approve than was needed, and other drugs that stay on the market harming patients long after the evidence is accumulated. That they should be pulled or should be at least some black box warning. And a competent FDA would do that balancing act. It's not they would ever get it perfect, because I don't think it's possible, but they would be much more reactive when evidence accumulates that a drug is harmful afterwards. I think that's really the key thing, which they're not doing.
I think you're right. I look back at, it was during the AIDS crisis, right? And one of the documents that came out with Zoloft was the FDA admitted, because unless there was a significant sea of change towards the society's collective view of the regulatory agency, we are going to come under attack years from now for not being as demanding as we ought to be for establishing the efficacy of antidepressant products. So right there to me was a prime example of, the AIDS took too long. And now they're they're admitting it in their own paperwork this was the early 90s, that they were admitting that they're probably approved Zoloft without establishing efficacy, but they couldn't because of the pressure they were getting from patients. So you're right, it is a balancing act. But then I always say, if it's a balancing act, at the end of the day, when you do start seeing harms emerge, then move faster. Move faster then. I don't want you moving slower. That's the time we need you to be moving faster. Or at least let us know that you're investigating it.
I think there was a law passed a few years back called the 21st Century Cures Act, and did a lot of things. But one of the things it did is it allowed drug companies to present intermediate endpoints. So rather than showing that a drug has some effects that patients really care about, it increases your survival rate or decreases your some symptom that's terrible, that's disabling you. Instead, they just had to show biomarker that this drug affects some biomarker. Probably the classic sort of scandal around this was this drug called Aduhelm, which is a drug that was approved by the FDA to treat Alzheimer's, or to delay the onset of Alzheimer's. Rather than showing that it actually delayed or improved the quality of life of patients with Alzheimer's, all they had to do was show that it changed the level of a biomarker. And it was a very expensive drug. And in fact, studies show that it had almost no effect on actual clinical outcomes that patients cared about. And yet the FDA approved it. The 21st Century Cures Act then makes it very, very fast to get drugs approved on intermediate endpoints that don't correlate very strongly with necessarily with things that patients really care about. At the same time, you'd think that if you're going to speed up drug approval, the counterbalance of that ought to be that they should speed up pulling drugs from the market, or at least putting black box warnings if there's any evidence at all that the drug has negative effects. And that's really what was the mistake here. Seems like that in fact the FDA since 2003 has gone more in that direction. That they become more and more conservative in calling that a signal is real, and that there ought to be a black box warning placed. Where at the same time they're much faster in approving the drugs, even before there's been good evidence establishing that it's beneficial for patients.
Interesting. So I see that a lot on my committee that I sit on. Most of the drugs that are coming before the Psychopharmacologic Drugs Advisory Committee are using some kind of fast tracking mechanism that allows them to use less than the standard, gold standard of clinical trials, right? And everything seems to be for an unmet need. And I say that because the unmet need is really what is it seems like everything's going to get find an unmet need, and it's how the industry wants to get it onto the market, because clinical trials are expensive, right? And so if you can do something with less people, with maybe not having to do 2 studies, you can do 1, maybe less people, you can use biomarkers, you're going to get the drug on the market faster. And then there's an assumption of the committee members, right? That is like, oh, well, we'll just just FDA put in a REMS program, a risk mitigation strategies program. So it comes out the gate with some kind of strategy to pick up any safety. But there's an assumption that it will get picked up and dealt with. But we know that safety does not get picked up fast. It almost has to be, we can let the drugs come on the market with, little less known, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but, it helps for the patient, whatever. But as soon as it's to do with the safety, we don't have that same standard. It almost is like, oh, it's got to be 100%. It is. And yet nobody knows that it's even being investigated, meaning nobody, meaning the patient and maybe even the doctor, is not even aware that there's an issue with that product because the FDA approved it. And they don't even understand what that meant by a biomarker. Because if you also then go and study the press releases that come out from these advisory committees, like one of mine was Nuplazid, which was a drug for Parkinson's psychosis. It was used, it was under breakthrough therapy, which it's a fast tracking mechanism that was put in place by, some of the congressional measures. But the way it was communicated to the public, all of the press releases and all of the patient, and I call them AstroTurf patient groups, like the big organizations that get monies from pharmaceutical companies, like the Michael J. Fox organizations, they all use the language breakthrough. And it's a breakthrough for patients. And so it sells this hope for patients, but they don't actually understand that breakthrough is actually a FDA regulatory mechanism that is really cleverly marketed. And my background, like I said, is marketing. I've spent my entire career in marketing. So I can see that game happening right away. I'm like, it's brilliant, but it sells and gives the wrong promise to patients and their caregivers.
I mean, so I think that's really the crux of it, right? So the question then is why? Why is the FDA acting essentially on behalf of the pharmaceutical companies and not representing patients as much as they ought to? And again, there's a balance. I mean, in principle, the pharmaceutical companies are doing discoveries on behalf of patients, but they have very strong incentives to put forward things that help patients and things that are only marginally beneficial to patients, where they may even have some harm. And it's the job of the FDA to police them, right? So, but it looks like, and I think there's good financial reasons why this is actually the case, that the FDA is acting on behalf of the pharmaceutical companies and not on behalf of the patients. And in fact, there's a law called, I think it was passed in the 80s, called the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, PDUFA, that allows, I'm not sure exactly, I think it was 80s, early 90s or something exactly when it's passed, but what it does is it allows drug companies to pay the FDA what they call user fees. The user fees then guarantees that the FDA will give expedited evaluation of the submissions by the pharmaceutical companies, and essentially from a patient's point of view, from a consumer's point of view, from a citizen's point of view, for all the world, what it looks like is that the pharmaceutical companies have bought the FDA. That it's a significant chunk of the operating budgets of the FDA. Even the phase 4 surveillance, which is supposed to the safety surveillance that happens after a drug is approved, it's funded by PDUFA, by pharmaceutical companies. And so, of course, the FDA is beholden to the pharmaceutical companies as opposed to representing patients.
Right.
Like
that when I found out about PDUFA and it's something that's a must-pass legislation every 5 years, Congress, it does gets reauthorized. And with that becomes more and more that the FDA or the drug companies are saying, hey, we need to meet these deadlines. And they're the ones sitting at the table negotiating with the FDA what they expect. And when you have over 50% of the budget or more that comes from the drug companies, you wonder if it's like the fox is guarding the hen house, right? Like who are you really beholden to? And I remember there was a time where they had a stakeholder meeting, the FDA did, where they brought in people like consumer groups like myself and the drug companies. And I go, we are going to always be at the kids' table at the Thanksgiving dinner, because we're not at the adult table. We're at the kids' table, and we're not in those rooms when you're negotiating. And so in my mind, we have used those opportunities every 5 years to try to do what we can to add some post-market, if you're going to make us do it, because it does have to get congressional approval, that might be where some of the things like Sentinel came and some of these other post-market, or even I remember once I testified before the U.S. Senate, and it was an idea that, okay, if we're going to have drug ads, well, then we should be able to put let people know that the FDA has a system called MedWatch that people can report their side effects, right? And so we came up with these ideas that you could throw into the reauthorization of the prescription drug, but unfortunately, it's now part of our system. And I think we could there was somebody in an attempt at one time, because I've been doing this for so long, it was a representative that said, well, let's bring it all into a joint, like something that wasn't going directly to the FDA, and it would be Congress, and then they would then distribute the money. But that went away a long time ago, that attempt. But I think, that is an issue that we really do need to talk about. And other countries are getting into that same kind of pattern as we are as well.
I mean, I think that the role that the pharmaceutical companies play is now no longer just drug discovery and then and evaluation. The role, and then sales and marketing, of course, around that. It's more than that. I mean, they fundamentally control fund certainly the regulators that are supposed to serve as independent regulatory bodies over them. Let's talk a bit about pharmaceutical marketing, and especially direct to consumer advertising. I mean, in the United States, you very often see ads on TV with where it's one of two kinds of ads for drugs. One is they tell you the name of the drug with happy pictures of people having happy lives, and then they'll tell you that the drug is used to treat some disease, and then they'll have some long list of side effects that they say at the end of the advertisement at 100 miles an hour, so you can't hear any of them. Then you also have drug advertisements where they have the happy pictures of people leading happy lives, the name of the drug, but there's no claim made at all about what the drug does. They just say, go ask your doctor for them. And there's no side effects either. Doctors, what they hear is that they get patients come in and say, well, I want this drug. There's tremendous pressure from patients then to be prescribed drugs for whom the doctor probably doesn't know a ton, and they're probably hearing about it through their patient. The U.S. and New Zealand are the only two countries in the world that allow this kind of direct-to-consumer advertising. How does that corrupt the drug sales, pharmaceutical company marketing? How does that? What effects does that have on our society?
Well, I think in itself, where you just said it's one of two countries that allows drug ads. It's not only does it get the consumer going in and asking brands. I mean, advertising works. It's big business. It used to be cars, fast food, Coca-Cola, etc. But it really, what it does is it helps to control the media. I mean, when your mainstream media, like your big networks and your papers, are their main advertisers are drug companies, you're going to be very careful. I know we hear this all the time. Well, they're two different departments. No, the reality is sales does impact the journalism, the editorial, and editorial, like also kind of can control the narrative. And if you look at even what we've seen in the last couple of years, almost all the big segments are brought to you by Pfizer, brought to you by Good Morning America, brought to you by Pfizer, and the sponsorship. And I think it's been a very interesting, because my background is I've spent my entire career in advertising. So I've watched this and I remember testifying at the FDA when they had hearings on the power of direct-to-consumer advertising, social media advertising. I mean, to this day, social media is running circles around the FDA. They can't control what's being said and whatnot, and the power of it. And so that is a huge problem. It works. The companies like it. Also, it's all the peripheral businesses that also support it too, like all the ad agencies and all of those. They know that the number one category who's spending the big bucks is the pharmaceutical companies. And so you have to ask why and wonder why. And then you look at other countries. They say, I know they've been trying to get direct consumer advertising, but these disease awareness is actually something where they can talk about a disease and there's a drug, but you don't know what it is. They don't have to put, they have different guidelines. But really, there's other sources of marketing that's actually even bigger than even our advertising. And that is the things like the patient advisory, a lot of these consumer groups and patient groups that come to the FDA advisory committees. They are all mouthpieces of the marketing department of pharmaceutical companies saying, we need this drug, we need this drug. Well, then you look at where their monies are coming from. And so it's, go in the journal, medical journals is also another huge source of marketing. So it really is a big marketing machine that is more than just the direct to consumers. But I do think that is very, very powerful in that it can help control narratives of what gets talked about in the media.
You could see this during COVID, right? So you'd have on the big network TV shows, they'd have, sponsored by Pfizer, they would very happily have they'd very happily have like Pfizer, people on the Pfizer executive board on the Sunday morning shows telling you about what they thought you should do with the COVID vaccines. Often with no disclaimer at all of a
Right.
conflict of interest. It fundamentally corrupts the media because then they're going to be slow to report patient stories of harms that are suffered because they'll worry. I mean, it's not possible to keep the news side independent so clearly and cleanly from the advertising side.
And we definitely saw that during COVID, right? Even now, I mean, how many years later are we now just starting to get a few stories of harms? And I mean, you've seen it personally. I know I've seen it personally with some of that, but it controlled a lot of the narrative, and it also controlled the celebrities. It controlled the marketing machines. And that is powerful. Like I look back to the entertainers, the nightly entertainment shows that were all promoting it as if they were the ad agency. I mean, it was fascinating. I mean, it was like literally you couldn't pay. I mean, this is what, as an advertiser, we would try to find these ideas that we would try to go, oh, we got to get product placement. We got to get it on the night show. We got to get it on the Today Show. We got to get it. And I'm thinking this was like the best product placement that money could ever pay for.
So let's turn to COVID then and the COVID vaccines, because we've gone through an exhausting list, I think, of pathologies that the FDA has in regulating drugs, in ways in which it doesn't represent patients, ways in which the pharmaceutical companies can control the outcomes, and the question then is: was the the way that the FDA treated the COVID vaccines, the way that the pharmaceutical companies marketed them, and the way that that big media dealt with it, was it fundamentally different, or just sort of like outsized version of more of the same?
Oh, I think it feels very fundamentally different, meaning that the whole system was working together. And there was no opportunity to actually even question or just slow down. I mean, granted, we were in a pandemic, but there was no conversation between just a debate, just a conversation. And, I have seen that a lot in my work. Even, when I look back to the antidepressants, it was only one size. Like the people who actually had a different debate, the experts in other countries, they weren't able to have a conversation either, or the name calling. We saw it with antidepressants, but it was big. I mean, it was in every part of our life with COVID. If you didn't take it, if you were just questioning, you were an anti-vaxxer, or if you were, it was just, but I saw it with antidepressants. We were called Scientologists if we questioned it, right? So I've already been down that game before, but it was magnified because it was also mandated and like one size fits all. And then, I just remember looking at it when it was all happening, that there were red flags, that you had marketing campaigns like bring your Vax card in and you got a free donut a day for a year. I was like, wait, this seems like it's sales promotion. And then like the companies you couldn't sue them. And I know that a lot of what we find out is when you're able to get into a drug company file. But even if you got harmed, like what about all these people that were forced and then they were harmed? Now what? And so there were so many things that felt like it was magnified, like beyond anything I've ever seen. And not only the US, but the worldwide. And they were all, the beauty of social media is that people can keep like track of what was being said in the US, what was being said in other parts of the world. And they were all using the same verbiage. So it was on a scale that I've never seen
I think
before.
I agree with you, Kim. It felt fundamentally different. Although the kind of techniques they used were in line with what we talked about before, but they did it in a concerted way, and it over such a long period of time with almost no pushback whatsoever from the regulatory agencies at all. There were a few incidents that still absolutely shocked me. Like at one point during the approval of the boosters in 2021. This is after essentially the original 2 doses that obviously failed to prevent people from getting and spreading COVID. The FDA approved a booster. And 2 FDA scientists resigned in protest over the lax regulation of the booster, the rushed approval of the booster. Marian Gruber and Philip Krauss resigned. And, it made almost no splash whatsoever. You have FDA scientists saying, look, we haven't really evaluated this product well enough to say everyone should take it. The FDA approves it anyways. And as if that didn't happen. And then you have like public health people saying everyone should take it. And as the boosters went on and on, the evidence necessary to get it approved got less and less. At one point, there was an FDA hearing over a booster approval that literally what the drug, I think it was Pfizer, that what it put forward was it was evidence of immunobridging on 10 mice. Like they hadn't even checked the booster on humans before they said, oh, well, it produces antibodies in mice and therefore it ought to be fine for humans because the antibodies before were good. It just felt, as you said, like this whole of society thing, all of society was like pushing it in a single direction. And anyone who spoke up and said, well, hold on a second, don't you want better evidence? Shouldn't patients be more represented? Got absolutely demolished. And part of it was actually part of the marketing of these drug companies, right? So for instance, there's a journalist named Li Fong who did a story. We found that Moderna had hired tens of thousands of health influencers to go to the nooks and crannies of social media and argue with anybody that if they were reporting a vaccine injury, that they were like somehow, mentally deficient or wrong. Like obviously, how could this drug have produced any vaccine injuries at all?
Well, so we use those all the time in advertising. They're called micro influencers, right? And so we hire them to go in if we're like advertising for, say, an airline. We'll get them and go into all the places where people are talking about. And if they talk smack about our client, they go in there and they will we know how to use them. And there's all technology around that. And so they're marketers and they're brilliant marketers. But, the unfortunate part is any conversation around harms was like censored, cut out. You couldn't have, it was like labeled that they would just take it out like it didn't exist. And, I look back and again, I keep going back to my 20 years when I got thrown into this mess. We didn't have social media back then. So we had to actually show up and we would get criticized to your face. Now people are just like taken out, like it doesn't even exist. And so, how can you have a true representation of what's happening in the world when only one side is actually presented to the world, right? And so I think, I look at now we're hearing people are like, oh, what a mess. These guys created their own mess. They created the mess by not allowing the conversation. They created the mess by not allowing the debate to be had, right? Where, I'm not a scientist, I'm a marketer. But I thought I remembered in my high school science class that it was you constantly tease out like, and you're probably laughing because you are a scientist. But, you constantly tease it out.
No, I'm laughing because...
And prove it wrong. And
Well, that's the thing is like the reason you get into science is because it's those conversations that like make science fun and interesting, where you're like talking about a topic that's not known about, and you learn from each other, and it's the debate that produces the knowledge, right? So you and I disagree on something, we then agree on an experiment to see, and if the experiment comes your way, then all of a sudden I'm going to change my mind and agree with you. That's the fun of science, right? It's not, I have the money, therefore I'm right.
Well, as so I have been involved with this project for a long time, selling sickness. And we always put the selling with like the money sign. And so I kind of feel like in some ways, science became the science with a money sign as a capital S, right? And that's what we saw. We didn't have science. We didn't have people like yourself. And I even go back to when I looked at all the Great Barrington Declaration and looking at having that, to me, was just fundamentally just a conversation of science. Let's have a debate. And so I hope that we've learned our lesson through this, that we can't force something and when it's new and it's novel and, I don't know. I think they've created more of a mess by not allowing that. And you can never force something without a conversation. I saw it just in my own world of putting out questions. I just did a video right around, because I did participate in the November 2nd Senator Johnson hearing. And it was a lot of the injured. And it was the first time I actually heard these injured. And I was just like, the idea that they were gaslit and whatnot. But afterwards, I did a whole video that I just put on my social channels on the questions I have as just a layperson. And I got berated by people. And these are people that I've known for my whole life and people who also are in my drug safety space that said I was right on everything else, but I was wrong on this. And it was just like this really bizarre world that we lived in the last 4 years. I'm like, I think it's the same players, if I'm not mistaken. It's all the same players, but magnified. And so I'm wrong.
This is the thing. I think that what we saw was an outsized version of the same pathologies. And it felt like such a fundamentally different thing because it was all of society was all singing the same tune with no capacity to push back. Otherwise, you're censored or smeared or whatnot. But the failure of that. Now there's tremendous numbers of people that understand that the drug companies made claims that were not true about the vaccine. If you got the vaccine, you could get COVID. You could spread COVID. I actually took the vaccine, and 4 months later, I got COVID. That's experience of many, many, many people. There were a tremendous number of people that are vaccine injured, and including things that now the FDA admits were real signals, like myocarditis in young men. So you have a very large number of people that now understand. I think maybe if they didn't during the pandemic, that something's gone tremendously wrong. And in a way, it's an opportunity to reform the system. So the question that from you, as we close the conversation is, you responded to tragedy very productively by becoming involved in the conversation, making sure that patient voices were heard, that the consumer voices were heard in the regulatory process. How can regular people get involved now? Like what advice would you give them so that they can also start to step up? And because I think that's partly what's good. It's not going to come just from the scientists and from politicians. It's going to and it's certainly not going to come from the drug companies themselves. It's going to take a mass movement of the sort that you started with the SSRIs to put in place the kinds of protections for patients and for consumers that really should be in place, and to make the FDA work on behalf of them like the way they should. So what can regular people do?
Well, first of all, I've been inside trying to fight the system, and I'm like, the system is not set to it doesn't want to change. I mean, there's too many, money and self-interest. So the real change is going to come from people on the ground on up, right? And it's people like the regular person who is courage is over fear, right? You speak up and you hold your feet to and not be afraid to speak truth, because it's your truth. And there'll be nobody until you are willing to speak your truth and not back down. And also, it does take, I'm not going to lie, it does take a lot of thick skin to do the hard right and not the easy wrong. The easy wrong is to stay small. But the reality is we all have a part in the ability to now fix the system. And that is, no one is going to, and I think it starts out with, no one's going to care more about you or your health than you will care about you or your health. And so I think even that premise that we used to think, oh, well, the government's going to care about us. I'm like, no, you destroyed that. And so I think we need to tell our story, speak up, and not be afraid, because if something happened, I can't imagine part of speaking up for me also was part of my healing, right? And so I think that is when I think about what we've all lived, a little bit of grief in the last 4 years of some sort, right? The grieving of our old lives, the pre-pandemic. And so part of gaining that strength back is by finding your voice and standing up and not being afraid, because there are more people that will start finding each other. And those are your people. And those are the people that we're going to need to build a new system going forward.
Well, Kim, I'm so grateful that you have raised your voice, that you have been brave, and you've put up with so much so that you can advocate for people, for regular people. I think that's it's going to take an army of Kim Witzaks to really restore the FDA to the proper place. And I'm grateful that you've stayed in that movement all the way through. Thank you for joining me on this podcast.
A lot of fun.
So this has been Professor Jay Bhattacharya on the Illusion of Consensus podcast, talking to Kim Witzak. Thank you for listening, and until next time.
Has the dust settled from the COVID policy response? Far from it. The storms are many. Inflation, learning losses, ill health, high crime, broken government services, displaced workers, substance abuse, mass loneliness, discredited science, real estate crisis, censorship, and overweening state power. The world is on fire with war, mass killings, crime, hunger, revolution. The lack of accountability, or even so much as an apology, is a foreshadowing. They'll keep their newfound powers and try it all again. Brownstone Institute is seeking answers, undertaking important research and publishing the results while providing fellowships for dissident scholars who have been professionally displaced. It's not about this one crisis. We urgently need to restore peace, prosperity, and integrity in science and journalism. Visit brownstone.org for more. We may never get to the truth, but we can get closer to the truth. There will be no stopping the efforts.